return to it, and I'll send it out to everybody, and then it will also be available in the resources section of the Pregnant Together community, which I'll talk a little bit more about throughout the presentation. So if you, most of you haven't been to a workshop that I've done before. So I like to keep things like really open and casual, and feel free to unmute yourself and just interrupt me at any point if you have a question. I really want to make sure that this information serves you and the place that you're at in your life in the moment. So you can also raise your hand. I usually do see those, but feel free to just jump in, and then I'll make sure we have until 5 o'clock PST. So I definitely want to make sure to leave like 10 minutes at the end for questions, to make sure that we can talk about all the things. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to choose a sperm donor today. And a lot of folks, I think a really common experience is just feeling overwhelmed with like the immensity of the decision, and then like all of the possibilities within each of these decisions. And so my goal is to help you leave this workshop feeling like the process can be more simplified and less overwhelming. So if you don't know me yet, I'm a midwife. I started as a midwife, mostly working with pregnant people giving birth. I started attending births in 2011, and then I started doing fertility care, especially for queer communities, in 2016. I'm the co-author of the book Baby Making for Everybody, where we talk a lot about how to choose a donor and fertility tracking and insemination and all of that. And then I'm also the founder of Pregnant Together, which I'm really, really excited about. It's a community for queer folks and solo parents, from trying to conceive through pregnancy and postpartum. And about half the folks who are here are in it. And it's just like a really sweet way to connect with other people going through the process. We, right after this, have a non-gestational parents meeting. We meet once a month. And then there's also groups for solo parents and trying to conceive and pregnant people. So be awesome to get to know you more in there. I also have 3 kids. They all have known donors. I conceived the youngest, who's pictured in this photo. He's 3 now. He just turned 3, but I got pregnant through IUI with a known donor who we use the directed donor program for at the Sperm Bank of California. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that for folks using known donors and kind of the logistics of that. So we're going to talk about general advice for deciding on donors. We're going to hold space for some grief and like just some of the feelings that come up in this process of needing to, choose someone we don't necessarily know or love in the process of growing our families. We'll talk a little bit about genetics, how genes work. We're going to go through like a bunch of pros and cons of known and anonymous donors. And then we're going to talk about what different things to consider when using fresh sperm or previously frozen sperm. We'll talk a little bit about genetic screening, legal considerations with known donors, the sperm bank process, and talking to our kids about their donors. And we'll see what else comes up in the process. So let's see, just kind of generally, the general advice and just the different things to think about in starting this process is I really recommend doing an exercise where you just think about all of the things that you would like to have in a donor, and write them all down. Write down all the qualities that you're hoping for, and then rank the top 5 and choose the top 3 and let those 3 guide you. I think it's really easy for people to get really overwhelmed in this process. And so I think the exercise of writing down everything that your dream donor would have, all of these qualities, and then like really look through them and get a sense of what those top 5 are, and then use really only your top 3. I just think that process will help simplify this choice. I really recommend not getting too caught up in the weeds. There are so many things to think about. And I see sometimes like a lot of folks in our community get kind of like an analysis paralysis in this process and kind of get stuck on the choosing a donor portion. And I want to remind everyone that like it's a big choice, it's an important choice, but it is also a stepping stone towards growing your family. And I really try to encourage my clients who I do coaching with and like and the members of the community just to like move forward, keep moving forward. So and then I also want to point out that sometimes it makes sense to switch donors at some point if the conception process isn't working or if something changes with a known donor. Like you're not, you don't have to stick with the same donor. I've had clients who have chosen different donors from a bank every insemination attempt because, you know, they couldn't afford to buy multiple vials and they just didn't want to pay for storage fees and they just didn't really care. You know, and then I have people who have like very, very clear ideas of what they want. They're like, we found the perfect donor and there's only one of them and we need to buy, you know, 8 vials. And like there's so many different ways to do it. I'll talk about how to make that decision if you're buying sperm bank sperm. I've also had people like choose a known donor and have a donor from a bank and do a fresh insemination and an IUI in a cycle. There's so many different ways to do it. So we'll talk about all of that and kind of getting creative about it and just figuring out what makes sense for you and your family. So I usually like to start all of the workshops that I do, just like thinking about just the emotions that come with this process. And I think, you know, for myself and for a lot of my clients, there can be a grief process in making this choice. You know, if you have a partner grieving, not being able to make a baby with your partner using, you know, each of your DNA or not having the family structure or the partner that you had originally hoped for. It's good to feel the grief. It's good to journal and talk to friends and have a therapist, simple ritual practice, you know, walking, meditation, all of these things are really essential in the whole TTC and pregnancy and parenting process. We're going to have a really awesome workshop in the community coming up called Tending Grief. I haven't posted about it yet, but we're going to talk about like specifically the grief that comes up around trying to conceive and family building and tools for dealing with it. So I'm excited about that. But yeah, I also think that the grief and these unprocessed feelings that many of us have when we start this process contribute to the feeling of overwhelm and like this feeling that we just can't really wrap our minds around this choice. I just see a lot of people having that, and I think it's really helpful to remember that, oh, there might be something emotional under that. It's not just that there are a lot of things to choose from, and often kind of addressing those emotions can be helpful in moving forward in a clearer way. And I also just want to say that this can be a really different experience for gestational and non-gestational parents. Those differences exist whether or not we acknowledge them. And I think that, you know, in coupled relationships, like people, I think especially in the queer community, when we're not used to necessarily dealing with difference in the same ways that most heterosexual people are, I think that the TTC and family building process can bring a lot of difference for us. Those of us that are in a couple, and it's just useful to acknowledge that and know that it's really important as non-gestational parents to get support for your own feelings. And know that it's okay to have different feelings than your partner about any and all aspects of this journey. And that's why yeah, I recommend if you are in a relationship in a couple doing that priorities process on your own and then coming together and giving yourself each some time to process what it is that you are looking for. Okay, genes are really complex and interesting. Most physical traits, as we know, are hereditary. Some personality traits might also be hereditary, but there's a big debate about this among scientists about how genes actually work, and it's not entirely clear. There are things like a person's ability to form deep connections, experience empathy. Those are all based on how they're raised. Some people deeply care about the genes of their donor being similar to those of their partner if they have one, or their family's of origin. Others don't have strong feelings. Any way that you feel is valid. Usually, for folks, maybe some of the most important things that I see are the donor's ethnicity, matching that of their family of origin or partner, but not always. And I do want to also say it's babies model their faces and their facial expressions after the people that they're closest to. So I see so often in communities like that babies come out and they look like their non-gestational parent in some way, or they take on the facial features of the people that are caring for them, which is really a beautiful way that that this kind of genetic, the appearances, it's not just about genes, it's also about like these relationships that we surround our children with. And we live in a world that really prioritizes genetic parentage, and that's like one of the cultural biases that the world has. And I think there's some unlearning that we all need to do around family looking all sorts of ways, and really creating those spaces for us and for our kids to create a vision of family that's different from the dominant cultural narrative. So a lot of folks, and I know some of you here are kind of in that question of going with known versus anonymous donors. So I want to start thinking about anonymous donors, so donors from a bank. From a legal and social perspective, it can often be really simple and straightforward to go with a sperm bank. They take care of all of the legal stuff. They're also they're really specific about the donors they choose. So they have like super high quality sperm, like high levels of motility and normal morphology, like the size is all normal. So they do a lot of that sorting for you. There are a lot of donors to choose from, which is a pro and a con, I would say. For a lot of people, the anonymity feels comfortable. We're moving away from having truly anonymous donors with, things like 23andMe and just the ability to do genetic testing at home. Most banks are now accepting only donors that are willing to be contacted when the child turns 18. And also those donors that said they weren't willing, many of the children are already contacting them because they have things like 23andMe and can access their genetic information. But we will talk about this later, about kind of the ethics of anonymous donors. I do strongly recommend going with the donor that is an open ID donor, meaning they've consented to being contacted when the child turns 18, because there's a lot of resources from donor conceived kids about how important that possibility of having a relationship with their known donor in adulthood, or with their anonymous donor in adulthood, is. Then another benefit is there's like almost no risk of STIs or other health concerns when it comes to anonymous donors. The cons are it's really expensive, and especially in this post-pandemic world, sperm bank sperm has gotten even more expensive and a little bit harder to find. So I know some folks are paying like $2,000 a vial for sperm. And I think it's changing my recommendations as far as like what fertility testing to do, and like that process around choosing your insemination path. Just like the cost of anonymous donor sperm is really high. There's also a lack of many donors of color, specifically Black donors and Filipino donors. It's there are a lot of reasons for this. One of the reasons is that sperm banks aren't generally like doing enough outreach to communities of color. Depending on which bank you go with, you will, there will be some options, but especially for folks looking for Black donors and Filipino donors and other donors of color that have smaller sample sizes, it makes sense to start looking sooner and making sure that you, like, if you find someone that you like, buy the vials because there's more of a scarcity for those donors, unfortunately. Another con, depending on how you feel, some people prefer knowing their donor personally. And the process is really, really, really overwhelming, going through those catalogs and making that choice. And so that's why, especially for people using the sperm bank, like stick with your top 3 priorities. It's really, really important to not have a long enough list to have like 30 people that you're choosing from. Like ideally you want like 3 people that you're choosing from. Okay. Oh wait. You don't need to hear this. This is what it looks like to get frozen sperm from the bank. This is what it comes in. That's like a little metal straw thing. There's like, it's not actually dry ice, what they use, but they keep it super, super cold. You have to ship it overnight or 2-day shipping via FedEx. You'll see I have those cute little old lady oven mitts that I use when I do my IUIs. And so it comes in that little container, and that tiny little vial of sperm is what costs $2,000, but it has over 10 million motile sperm in it. And it's pink because that's the color of the sperm wash that they use to separate the seminal fluid from the sperm itself. You have to be really, really careful when you're touching it. It's way too, it will burn you if you touch it. So hence the old lady gloves. Yeah, so I usually warm it up in my gloved hands for a couple of minutes until it gets warm enough to touch, and then have folks put it under their arm or like in between your breasts or chest until it gets body temperature. And when it liquefies is when we do the insemination. Before I start talking about known donors, does anyone have thoughts or questions that they want to chat about real fast or not fast? No? Okay.
I have a question. I don't know. Are you going to talk about like legal considerations with known donors? Is that something we go? Okay. I'm very interested.
Great. Yes. Unfortunately, it's very regional. So, I'll talk about it in general and what I understand from living in California, but I won't be able to talk specifically about the situation in Montreal. Okay, known donors. So some people appreciate like that really personal approach and that the donor can have some kind of relationship with the child. Another pro that I really see as a midwife is that fresh sperm lives for longer and therefore can improve your chances of conception sometimes, and is easier to do an at-home DIY that should say actually intravaginal insemination. So you don't necessarily depending on your fertility picture, you don't necessarily need to involve a practitioner in your conception process, which I would say is a pro. Cheaper than buying sperm from a bank. Most folks aren't paying their known donors for donations. Sometimes people do, like, I remember we gave our known donor like an Instacart gift certificate. And, there's like gifts and things that you can do with your known donor, and then legal fees. So, and we'll talk more specifically about what the legal process looks like. But depending on what state or country you live in, it might make sense to hire a family lawyer to help protect your family. Like in California, the laws are pretty friendly for queer families. And so you don't necessarily need to hire a lawyer, but there are some, not super expensive, but there are some legal things to consider, like signing the known donor contract, getting it notarized, doing a second parent adoption if there's a second parent involved, all of that stuff. Some cons of the known donor process is that sometimes the donation process can feel awkward. Sometimes people don't love the like dealing with the fresh semen. You need to make sure that you sign a known donor contract, sign a donor contract. In the community, there is a downloadable, actually, no, it's not. I need to add a downloadable donor contract in the community. On my website for the book, which is Baby Making for Everybody, there is a known donor contract that you can download. There's also a sample letter that you can use that we wrote to ask someone to consider being a sperm donor. So if you go to babymakingforeverybody.com, it's in the resources section. It's really important to have super clear conversations about sexual health practices and STI testing because you're basically fluid bonding with this person. There are more legal hoops to jump through to protect your family in most states and countries. And in some cases, the relationship with the known donor can go sideways, and it really depends where you live. Really, you hear more of those scary stories, like in countries like in the south of the US, where laws aren't as protective of queer families than they are like in California and Washington, for example. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between fresh and frozen sperm when it comes to conception. So fresh sperm lives for longer than frozen sperm. It lives for about 72 hours, sometimes more, sometimes up to 5 days. So especially for folks whose ovulation is more irregular, or if it's harder to keep track of, this can sometimes make the conception process easier. Previously frozen sperm lives for 12 to 18 hours, possibly 24. So it's really important to get timing right when using previously frozen sperm. And I strongly recommend doing IUI, intrauterine insemination, if you're using previously frozen sperm. There are people that do get pregnant using unwashed previously frozen sperm, but the rates of it's about 50% less likely that you'll get pregnant that way. And so I'll just talk for a second about sperm washing because I kind of skipped over that. So basically in seminal fluid, there's the sperm and then there's lots of other stuff. There's like mucus and like nutrients for the sperm that protect it from the acidity of the vaginal canal and all this stuff. And so when I talk about washing sperm, it's this process where we take the seminal fluid and mix it with sperm wash in a centrifuge that makes it spin really fast. And because the sperm is heavier, the sperm cells sink to the bottom and all the mucus and the other stuff come to the top. And so you get that those sperm cells, and you mix it with some other sperm wash and then insert it directly into the uterus or freeze it. And so that is why it makes sense to do the IUI, the intrauterine insemination, with a provider, because once you wash it, it doesn't have all the protective things that it needs to make it through the vagina and the cervix and into the uterus. And which is why, yeah, I just really strongly recommend. You can buy unwashed, previously frozen sperm from the bank, but I generally don't recommend it because each attempt is about an 8 to 10% chance of conception with the unwashed frozen sperm, and about 18 to 20% chance of conception with an IUI for folks with no fertility issues. Cool. I already talked about everything in this slide. So this is what I talked about, what is in seminal fluid, how we do an IUI. And I think it's really helpful to understand which insemination method you're going to use, because I do know folks that have gotten all ready for their IUI, their intrauterine insemination, and then realize that they bought unwashed sperm from the bank. So it's really important to, they do make it pretty clear. There's ICI ready vials and IUI ready vials. And I strongly recommend getting the IUI ready. If you're in a place like the Bay Area, there are a lot of awesome midwives who do at-home IUIs. I have some recommendations if you want them. Unfortunately, in Canada, the laws around at-home midwifery care are more complex. But yeah, depending on where you are and the type of providers you have access to, you can do your attempts outside of a clinic setting. Some folks will need to go into a clinic setting for different reasons. I also lead a workshop on fertility tracking and talking about insemination methods. We did that one a couple weeks ago, and there is a recording in the community if you want to check that out, but we're not going to focus on it as much today. So a lot of people wonder about genetic screening, and I would say, it's a personal choice. It can be helpful to do genetic screening on yourself first, especially if you have a family history of certain genetic conditions that you'd want to screen for. Like in my family, I have a distant cousin who died of cystic fibrosis, and I know that my mom is a carrier of cystic fibrosis. So before I started trying to get pregnant, I did that test myself and to see if I was a carrier, and I wasn't, but if I was, I would have really made sure that my donor was also not a carrier. People feel differently about the process, and unfortunately in most sperm banks, you need to pay extra to get access to the donor's genetic material. So I think there's kind of two schools of thought when it comes to this process. I think a lot of people are like, okay, most folks who are, in heterosexual relationships and trying to get pregnant, they're just trying to make a baby and not going through all of these checks and balances in trying to assess, if this is a perfect match. And there are so many genetic conditions that we can screen for, and so many that we're not even tracking for. There's a member in the community who's a geneticist and who chose a donor from a bank, and she talks about, just how many genetic conditions there are, how we can't control for everything, and that unless you know that in your family there's some trait that is relatively common, it's often kind of like a rabbit hole that you don't necessarily need to go down. Other folks, like there's another community member who found a perfect donor for them. They were like super happy about their donor, and then they saw that they were a carrier for a certain condition, and so to reduce their own anxiety, they did a genetic screening test. And a pro tip is to get the same genetic screening that they did for the sperm donor, because they can test for hundreds of different things. It's really helpful if you go with the same company, if you can, because then they'll test for the same things and it'll all be in the same place and you can compare. It can be really overwhelming to try to compare two different genetic tests. It can be done, but challenging. They also have genetic counselors that work at many of the sperm banks. So that is an option if you feel kind of confused about your particular risk levels. If you are a member of the community, we have a discount code for the Seattle Sperm Bank. So you can actually use their code to access all of their donor catalogs for free for the first 3 months. I think it's a really useful exercise, especially when you don't have, I think it's like maybe $70 to access it, but it's nice to not have to pay for it. It's a useful kind of thought experiment to go through their donor catalog and just like see how you feel, especially if you're, not necessarily in a rush to pick a donor now. You can just see all of the information that they have available and kind of think about where you are on this spectrum of things. So let's talk a little bit more about the legal considerations with known donors. So yeah, so I spoke about it a little bit before. Finding a known donor can be cheaper upfront, but it may require some legal fees, and that depends on where you live. So certain states have friendlier laws for non-traditional families. I do recommend doing your own research and potentially speaking with a family lawyer who's based in your state. There is a recording in the events recording section of an event that we did with a queer family lawyer based in California, who talks a lot about protecting your queer or solo parent family. There are some different considerations for solo parents and for partnered parents, because basically after the child is born, you go through if there are two parents, you go through the second parent adoption process. Even if you put both of your names on the birth certificate isn't protective of the non-gestational parents' rights outside of the state. So if there are two parents, really, really important to go through that second parent adoption process. And as part of that process, the known donor needs to rescind their rights to parentage. And that's just like a piece of paper that they sign and get notarized. That's part of the second parent adoption process. There are different schools of thought from lawyers that I've consulted around protecting your solo parent family, because that second parent adoption process doesn't happen. It is still important to have the known donor rescind their rights, and it will be upheld in certain courts, is my understanding. But there might be some other things to consider when there isn't another parent filling that place of the known donor's like presumptive role as a parent. So depending on where you are, I do think, most lawyers will, offer like a 1 hour consult, or even shorter, like maybe even 15 minutes. And then there are a lot of community resources, and there are in the community some other folks who are in Canada and different places that, our communities are good at sharing our resources. So hopefully there are folks that can help guide you to, particular information in your own state. Let me check second parent adoption is also important with sperm bank donors. So it's important no matter where you get your sperm from. What you don't need to do if you have sperm bank sperm, when they donated, the donor already rescinded their right to parenthood. So they don't need to sign anything after the child's born, but in a couple, you do still need to go through the second parent adoption process. And yeah, that part is really important. Depending on where you live, you can file it yourself with the courts, or you might want to have a lawyer file it for you. A lot of the information you can get ready ahead of time. I really recommend doing as much paperwork as possible before the baby's born, because after the baby is born, you're going to have very little time to do anything else. So you do need to have their birth date and time and all of that, but you can fill out, other information and get it ready to submit to the courts after the birth. Shoot, I had another thought, but it escaped me. Okay, how are we doing on time? Good, we'll have lots of time to talk. Okay. A lot of folks ask how to choose a sperm bank. So sperm banks it's a kind of weird industry. They're relatively unregulated. There is one nonprofit sperm bank, the Sperm Bank of California, based in Berkeley. They're really great. They're really small. They're really easy to talk to. They have a pretty good diverse selection of donors, but if you're looking specifically for Black donors, and most people that are looking for very specific donors go to Cryobank, which is based in LA. They're also really great with working with queer and solo parent families. They're just a lot bigger, so it kind of depends. I also really like the Seattle Sperm Bank, and they're the ones that did, that gave us that discount code. And there's also, if you go into the community, Elise, who is like their outreach person, did an event with us many months ago, almost a year ago now, but just talked about that whole process and kind of showed what it's like. So you can access that recording. I believe it's in the TTC section of the community. One thing that I think is really important, well, first of all, like feeling out how communication with the sperm bank feels. You know, some folks don't mind working with a big sperm bank as long as they get back to you. Sometimes it's really hard to get a hold of them. So feel out communication. I would say it's really important. The FDA recommends limiting donor conceived children to 25 per donor. Some banks have smaller minimums. So you want to find out, usually they're pretty forthcoming with this information, but you want to find out what their minimum is. Yeah, it's really important to ask them. And then a lot of banks are now kind of facilitating connection with families that use the same donor. So there are a lot of like meetups or groups that happen with, you know, folks that are using the same donor, and they get to, you know, I hear stories about them like getting together for like family reunions once a year and kind of building creative families in that way, which is super, super sweet. A lot of people wonder how much sperm to buy, and it's a big question. I would say, I mean, mostly I think it depends on your budget. Generally, for folks with no fertility issues, it takes about 4 IUIs to achieve a pregnancy. So, and that's an average. Some folks get pregnant on their first or second. Some folks get pregnant on their 8th or 9th. Some folks will do 3 unmedicated IUIs and then change to medication. We don't have time to go into those decisions, but if money weren't an issue, and say you want to have 2 children, knowing it takes 4 IUIs to achieve a pregnancy, then maybe the recommendation would be to buy 8 vials of sperm. It's generally about $500 a year to store it. So that's another consideration for cost. Yes, as I mentioned, a lot of folks, you know, might buy like 2 to 4 vials if they can, and then kind of reassess. I know lots of families that are like, oh, actually, I do want to have another child, and they find a different donor, or folks that are like, I really, really care about, you know, my children having the same donor, and so doing everything that they can to buy as much sperm as they think they'll need, or potentially even making a choice like doing IVF to create embryos and then freezing the embryos. I really recommend that folks get creative about buying sperm and do like, you know, I think in our culture, we really normalize paying tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars for weddings, and like doing like a big baby shower thing. And I think that I've heard a lot of really sweet examples of just doing creative things like around having folks, you know, at a wedding or for a birthday, like set up a family building account or do some sort of gathering where folks are actually, you know, doing a GoFundMe for cost of sperm. I think people are thinking of creative ways to make this more feasible. I also, and I am speeding up a tiny bit because I want to make sure that we have time to chat at the end of this, but there is also an option if you have a known donor who doesn't live in your city to do a directed donor program where you have your known donor donate to a bank and they process the sperm and then they ship it to you. So I do really recommend this for folks who live far away from their donor, because the logistics of using a known donor who lives far away is really tricky. You do have to also think about shipping costs. It can be a couple $100s to like overnight or 2-day ship that big container of sperm. And then also to say sperm banks and the whole, you know, fertility clinic industry itself, they were built for heterosexual couples experiencing infertility. So folks can often face some annoying homophobic and transphobic hoops especially when using a known donor. So there are like certain legal things that the FDA regulates around quarantine periods for your known donor, when the sperm bank will release their genetic material if you don't sign a paper that you're already intimate sexual partners with them. So some things to consider in dealing with it. We don't have time to delve into all of those logistics, but if you have more questions about them at the end, I'm happy to answer. Okay, so just a reminder that this is not the biggest choice that you will make as a parent, and it can feel really big, but it really is just one of the steps towards growing your family. There are so many choices in parenting that feel really intense, and I think that this choice to, in deciding on a donor is like really good practice for all of these other really big choices when it comes to like how to feed the baby, if you're going to sleep train them or not, what kind of school you're going to put them in. Like there's just so many big choices that we make over and over as parents. And I think this is the beginning of that journey of becoming a parent. And I think that that's like a helpful perspective and in hopefully not getting so lost in the overwhelm of the process. It's also totally okay to change your mind. If you choose a donor and then you see another donor that you're like, or like, oh, actually my known donor of my dreams, like said no, but then they actually changed their mind. Like you can, unless you get pregnant, you can change your mind. And then, yeah, when you're running around your child and trying to get them to put on their pants, you are not going to be thinking about where you got half of your genetic material. You're just going to be focused on like the day-to-day realities of parenting. And it doesn't, at least in my experience, it's not something that like comes up all the time. And I think it feels bigger before we're actually in the process of parenting. And on that note, I do just want to end the presentation talking about talking to our kids about their donors. There's a lot of research now talking about how important it is to speak to donor conceived kids early and often about how they came to be, that it's really important for their like mental and emotional health in just normalizing this process. We spoke a little bit already about the ethics of open ID donors, that there's a organization called, I think it's the DCC, the Donor Conceived Community.org, that has groups for donor conceived children. And it's very clear, like the folks whose parents talked to them about having donors and made that normal feels really different than the folks who found out later that they were donor conceived. I really love the book, What Makes a Baby by Corey Silverberg. It's just like super like, this is an egg, this is a sperm, this is a uterus. These are all the things that are required to make a baby. I read it with my kids often. I have a 3-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 13-year-old. And we talk about their donor a lot. And, it's like I think a few times now, my 3-year-old has been like, do I have a dad? And I'm like, no, sweetie, you have 2 moms and a donor. And, we just kind of like normalize that process. Zach's Safari is a sweet book about a 2-mom family with a donor conceived kid. There are a lot of them, and just helpful to normalize it. And depending on where you live, and like the age of your child, those conversations will change. But I do think that it's really important to just kind of plant that seed when we're thinking about this process. Okay, great. We have 6 more minutes. I hope we have, sorry, I didn't leave as much time as I wanted to answer your questions. But yes, I'm also available. Like I'll put my email in the chat. And if you're not yet part of the community, you're welcome. You can DM me in the community, or you can just email me. And if you have questions that we don't have time to get into now. Does anyone have thoughts or questions that they want to share?
I have a quick question. I was wondering if there's like a cost associated with trying to get your genetic screening from the same company that the donor got their screening from, and what that looks like?
Yeah, it depends on, so your primary care provider should be able to order you a genetic screening test, and it depends on your insurance. And we live in a country that makes the insurance process such a freaking headache. But you can request, there are some more obscure genetic screening companies and some less obscure ones. So like if you see, you look at the donor catalog and you see your donor and you're like, oh, they used Natera testing, you can bring that name to your doctor and say, hey, like, is there any way to order this specific test?
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. What else?
One of the things that we've been looking at, a cat on me, bad timing. Thank you, babe. Cat rescue. One of the things that we've been looking at is like the writing and stuff that the donors, we're looking right now at California Cryobank, and they have like, the donors like answer personal, almost little personal essay style questions. And I'm curious if you've heard any, like, to what extent, like, do people share those kinds of things with their kids? Like that the bank is like, think of this as something you'll share with your kid later, which is a lovely thought. And I guess I'm like trying to figure out, is that, realistically like something we should really be thinking about? Because that feels like maybe something that would help a kid connect with this stranger who they don't actually know.
Right.
More like knowledge of that person. Or is it like, what's your kid gonna care if like your donor likes to play the cello or whatever?
There was one that set a skateboard on fire.
A bad influence from day zero. I love it.
Totally. Yes, it's a great question. I think it really depends on the kid. Actually, like our oldest doesn't really seem to care that much about her donor, and like in a way that may change, but like doesn't really seem that interested in him. And then our 6-year-old is like feels deeply connected to the person that donated his sperm, and I think would love that sort of thing. And I think it probably depends on the kid and also the parents. Like I know that there are some folks that like put a lot of time into like creating this beautiful book of like, this is the story of how you came to be, and this is your donor, and here's some information about this person. And I think it's beautiful if that works for you. And then I think, for other folks, it's kind of like, cool, like they know that this person exists, and like maybe when they turn 18 or like in their 20s they'll want to explore that, but it isn't so much of a focus. Some folks will like save the vial of sperm that they get, the container, and like put it in a baby book with like the cord when it falls off and like sweet things. But yeah, it's really personal. And but I think having at least the option of some sort of understanding about this person is helpful. Good question. Yes. Okay. Well, I am going to send an email to all of you with the recording of this. And if you're not yet part of the community, I'll send like a special link where you can get your first month free. And yeah, just be sweet to keep connecting. I am, and I don't have the day on the top of my head, but in April, I'm leading a workshop on known donor relationships. I think it's in mid-April. So that's coming up. And that'll be the first time that I'm doing that particular workshop. So we can dive deeper into the known donor stuff. And yeah, this is, I mean, you all are, at such a unique and special and like exciting and also stressful time of the process. And yeah, I'm really just wishing you ease in making this decision. I'll just throw out there before we hang up, I also do like one-on-one coaching, either like one session or like 6 packages or just 6 sessions and like lead folks through this process if it is continuing to feel overwhelming, and community members get a discount. And yeah, really, I'm just really passionate about like making this process as easy for folks as possible, because there are a lot of hoops to jump through and it can be really overwhelming. So thank you for spending this hour with me, and feel free to contact me later. And yeah, take good care, everybody. Good luck in this big decision.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.